Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and this evening's St. Lee Distinguished Lecture. I'm Khong Foong, Lee Ka-shing Professor of Political Science and co-director of the Center for Asia and Globalisation at the school. I'm sure, like me, you are brimming with excitement to hear what our speaker, Professor Kenneth Schultz of Stanford University, has to say. And like me, you're probably thinking the timing for his lecture couldn't be better or more excruciating. For exactly in a week, Americans will elect their next president. This is an election with tremendous stakes, not just for America, but for much of the rest of the world, including Asia and Singapore. Before introducing our speaker, allow me to say a few words about the St. Lee Distinguished Lecture Series. This series is made possible by a generous benefaction from the late businessman and philanthropist Dr. Lee Sing-Tee, director of the Lee Group of Companies. It is a prestigious program that has brought many prominent scholars and policymakers to Singapore to address critical international issues and is aimed at enlivening public discourse on these issues. Past speakers include ASEAN Secretary General Dr. Khong, Indian Foreign Minister Subramaniam Jayashankar, former US Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage, Professor Francis Fukuyama, and former Governor of Jakarta, Mr. Anies Baswedan. So the school is most grateful to Dr. Lee and the Lee Foundation for making this series of lectures possible through their generosity. Now for a few words on our distinguished speaker, Kenneth Schultz, who is William Bennett Munro Professor of Political Science at Stanford University and one of the most distinguished international relations scholars of his generation. At Stanford, Professor Schultz teaches courses on international relations theory and American foreign policy, two of my favorite topics. His research examines international conflict and conflict resolution. Among his publications are Democracy and Coercive Diplomacy, a classic in the field, and World Politics, Interests, Interaction, and Institution, not to mention numerous articles in top peer-reviewed journals. He was the recipient of the 2003 Karl Deutsch Award given by the International Studies Association and the 2011 Dean's Award for Distinguished Teaching awarded by Stanford's School of Humanities and Sciences. So without further ado, I hope you can join me in welcoming Professor Kenneth Schultz to come on stage to deliver the St. Lee Distinguished Lecture on the US presidential election and the future of US foreign policy in Asia and beyond.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm going to say I'm really honored and delighted to be here and to have been invited to give this distinguished lecture. For my wife and I, this is our first time in Singapore, and we've been enjoying our time here and look forward to the experience and all the hospitality we've received. I can also add that I'm not sorry to be away from the United States this week. It is a fraught time, honestly, and the election is creating a great deal of tension. And of course, that's because the stakes are quite high for America and for the world. And I know from the reason this room is full is because we're all very anxious to get an understanding of what might happen in the aftermath of our election. And I look forward to talking about that today and answering your questions. But I'll just preface it by saying that I don't know who's going to win. So if you were hoping to get any special insight into what the outcome will be, you'll be disappointed. What I hope to do in this lecture is to cover three main themes. First, I want to put the 2024 election into some broader context of developments that have been happening in U.S. foreign policy and the politics of U.S. foreign policy over the last decade or so. Then I want to think about the effects of the election, first through the lens of thinking about the two parties. What do they agree on? What do they disagree on? And that's a useful guide for thinking about what the implications of the election might be for foreign policy in different areas of the world. And that's a pretty traditional way to think about an election, think about it as kind of a normal context between two parties. But then the final theme is that in former President Donald Trump, we have a candidate who's not very normal or pretty non-traditional in the sense that he's articulated views that are really quite extreme and break in important ways from traditions of American foreign policy. And what I want to suggest is that we need to pay particular attention to the uncertainty that gets generated by the very nature of Trump himself. It generates uncertainty that makes it hard to predict what he's going to do. And this uncertainty also has really important impact in its own right on the outcomes in international politics. So let me start by talking about the election in some context here. And I want to highlight two main trends that have been happening really for decades, but that come to the fore and crystallize in today's election. The first is what we call political polarization. So this, if you're even a casual observer of American politics, you recognize that there has been a pulling apart of the two parties, that their positions are becoming more distinct from one another, that the center is disappearing in the sense of the kinds of people who might build bridges between the parties are becoming rarer. And even animosity and hatred between people who identify with the different parties has increased. And this has a tendency it has some important implications for foreign policy. It can lead to instability across administrations as you get swings from one party to the next with very different preferences. And we've seen that over the last several alternations in power between Democrats and Republicans. It also leads to deadlock within the political system, where it makes it hard to generate consensus within Congress to get legislation passed. It's led to an increased concentration of authority in the president in response to that deadlock. And so that's one really crucial feature of what we've been living with. With respect to foreign policy in particular, there's also been a declining support for the kind of broad center of internationalism that really dominated U.S. politics for the entire post-World War II period. So from World War II on, after the United States took on a much more global role in its foreign policy, there was a consensus about several aspects of what that foreign policy should look like. So that this consensus concluded that America should play an active role in the world, that it couldn't retreat into isolation, that the United States benefited from having networks of alliances around the world, particularly its allies in Europe and in East Asia. And finally, that the United States benefited from an open economic system where there was openness to flows of trade and finance, and that this was good for the United States economy, it was good for American businesses, it was good for American consumers. It's not to say that this was an uncontested consensus throughout this period, but the broad center of American politics kind of held on to this center. And over time, though, what we've seen is increasing challenges to that consensus. So with respect to the first part about having an active role in the world, we've seen louder and stronger arguments that the United States should exercise greater restraint, that being active on the world stage comes with significant costs, that we don't have the resources to both deal with the world's problems and our problems at home. With respect to allies, we've seen quite recently, particularly with President Trump, the sense that allies they can entangle us in conflicts in which we have no interest. They take advantage of the United States. They don't shoulder their share of the burden in providing for their own security. And so a greater skepticism about the value that allies play for the United States. And then finally, a strong reaction against the wave of globalization that really took off in the 1990s, the significant openness to trade and financial flows, which generated a backlash and has led to an argument that the United States doesn't always benefit from open trade, but in fact, U.S. workers have been severely harmed by that. Now, all of the elements of that critique have been around to one degree or another, and you could have heard them at different times on either the left or on the right in the American political system. So in some sense, all those aspects of skepticism, of internationalism, they're not new. But what we've seen recently is that they crystallize in President Trump, that he showed that you could win the nomination of the Republican Party 3 times now and win the presidency, as he did in 2016, on the basis of a very broad-based critique of the internationalist consensus in U.S. foreign policy. I want to show you some slides, some data that shows some of these trends and how they've played out over time, to kind of put these in context. So this first figure here is showing you a long time series of responses to questions people were asked about whether the United States should play an active role in the world or whether it should not. And what you can see here is that the number bounces up and down, but I want to focus your attention on the red and the blue, the red being the answers by Republicans and the blue being the answers given by Democrats. And what you see is that historically Republicans were the ones that were most supportive of an active role in the world. But starting in the early 2000s, those lines start to cross. And now you see a wider gap between Republicans and Democrats in terms of their belief in whether the United States is better off playing an active role in the world. You see that also dramatically here, where you get a measure of whether, again, a different measure of whether the United States should be active in international politics. And you see here the line among Republicans expressing more isolationist views crosses the line of the Democrats, again, kind of in the early 2000s. And so the party that had been more internationalist has become less so. There's disagreement between the parties on who the greatest enemy is. So this is where people were asked, who is the greatest enemy of the United States? And so you can see, again, in red you have responses by Republicans, and blue Democrats. So overwhelmingly, Republicans see China as the greatest enemy of the United States, where Democrats are more likely to see Russia as the greatest enemy. I note with some interest that there's a small percentage of people who said the U.S. itself is its greatest enemy, and you know, there's a case to be made. Okay, so there's disagreement on even if one were to be active in international politics, against which potential adversary should our policy be focused. With respect to allies, we've seen greater skepticism in the Republican Party for the NATO alliance in Europe, right, which has long been the cornerstone of U.S. security towards Europe. Once again, you see this pattern of the red line in the early period being on top, where Republicans are more supportive of NATO, but those lines cross, and now a big gap has widened up between the two parties in terms of their willingness to increase or keep the same their U.S. contribution to NATO. And then finally, you see a big change in attitudes towards foreign trade. So right here you have data on the belief that trade is an opportunity for growth for the United States. Once again, you had the Republicans tended to be the party of free trade in the early part of this graph. Those lines cross. And now a gap has opened up, with Republicans being the more skeptical of free trade and the Democrats more pro. So what's happened here then is that we've seen a real shift in the parties, that both kind of a widening of a gap between them, and the Republican Party becoming a party that internalizes much of this skepticism towards internationalism. And I could give a whole separate talk on why this is happening, and we don't have time for that. But an important part of the story is what scholars identify as the diploma divide, which is a big gap that's opened up in the voting behavior of people with and without college degrees in the United States. So people with college degrees are now much more likely to be Democrats. People without college degrees, particularly whites who without college degrees, are much more likely to be Republican. And so what that means is now Republicans are drawing support from people who tended to see themselves as the losers of this internationalist foreign policy, people who saw themselves as having faced job loss and income insecurity due to globalization. So, therefore, that's what kind of brings us to today, where we have an election between Kamala Harris, who's a relatively mainstream Democrat to the extent that we know, and Trump, who is this new kind of Republican who's brought together all these elements of a criticism of internationalism into his own brand of foreign policy, his brand of America First foreign policy. So what I want to do then is go through now several key policy areas with attention to where the parties agree and where they disagree. And I want to start with policies towards Asia, or that are most relevant for this region of the world. where I would say U.S. foreign policy is seen primarily through two lenses. Those are the lens of competition with China and the lens of trade. And what I want to suggest to you is that on both of these issues, the parties are similar in broad sweeps, but they differ in some very key details. Let me just show you a couple of polls with respect to that before I launch into the policy issues. So this is poll data showing people's feelings towards China. So people are asked to rate their views of China from 0, meaning they're very cold towards China, to 100, meaning they'd feel very warm and friendly. And what you can see here is there's been a decline in U.S. views towards China. That decline is happening among partisans of both parties, although Republicans tend to be colder on China than Democrats. But there's not a big partisan divide in respect to this particular question. This is a poll in which people were asked their support for different potential responses to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And I just want to point out two patterns that you see here. The first is that there's very little in the way of partisan difference. That is, the Republicans and Democrats tend to give very similar answers to this question here. There is a great deal of support for putting economic or diplomatic sanctions on China in that event. A little bit less for providing military aid to Taiwan, and considerably less for providing military support, either with the U.S. Navy or ground troops. The thing that I want to suggest to you here is that, in general, there's a lot of bipartisanship around this sense of emerging competition with China, and there are several key features of this that are likely to be baked in regardless of which candidate wins the next election. So building U.S. military capacity in the Indo-Pacific region is something that both candidates would do if elected. There's been an emphasis on reducing economic dependencies, particularly in critical areas. And so a lot of support for tariffs. We know that Trump imposed tariffs on China in his first term. Biden kept those tariffs in place and has in fact added some more. And both Trump and Harris are talking about additional tariffs on China. We've also seen greater reliance on industrial policy that is trying to invest in ways to onshore certain critical industries, such as in semiconductors. And finally, regardless of which party wins, we're going to see efforts to curtail the kinds of scientific and technical cooperation that might lead to the transfer of critical technologies. This is something that we're seeing quite starkly at our own university, where all sorts of questions are starting to arise about the risks that we undertake engaging in scientific collaboration with China or with Chinese companies. So there's some broad similarities there's some broad issues here that are going to likely hold regardless of which candidate wins. But there definitely are significant differences in approach as well, particularly when it comes to how the U.S. relates to partners and allies in the region. So the Biden administration focused a lot on building partnerships and strengthening ties, not just with our partners in the region, but also between our partners in the region. So efforts to kind of strengthen the network of alliances and partnerships among the different countries that we cooperate with. I expect Harris would continue that, kind of consistent with a general philosophy among the Democrats that multilateralism is a good thing and worth bolstering. Trump, as we know, has a much more skeptical view of the value of allies and has been more willing to wield threats of abandonment in order to extract concessions from allies. And so he's, as we know, various times suggested pulling troops out of South Korea, pulling troops out of Japan. When asked recently if he would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion, his gut reaction was, well, if they pay us. So there's a very kind of transactional attitude that he has, which makes me think, in addition, rather than trying to kind of build multilateral ties between our partners, he would rather not. In some sense, what he would rather do is to be able to pressure each one of them individually. And so there will definitely be tenser times with partners in the region under a Trump administration than under a Harris administration. The second key issue, I think, that's of crucial importance to Asia, and that it has to do with trade. And here, too, there's some broad similarities between the two parties in that both have become more skeptical of trade and more open to imposing barriers to trade. So lots of discussion now about tariffs, which, if you rolled back 20 years or so, we thought we'd gotten rid of tariffs, right? There'd been this huge, we'd conquered tariffs and we'd moved on to other things, but there's lots of talk about tariffs. Democrats also tend to push for labor and environmental standards in trade treaties that are often objectionable to partners. We've seen the disruption of the World Trade Organization's dispute resolution mechanism. This started under President Trump when he put a blockade on the appointment of appellate judges to the WTO. But Biden has continued it. And so either administration is likely to continue to push for reforms of the WTO. Finally, I don't think there's much appetite for new trade deals, unless Trump likes renegotiating old ones that he considers unfair. But I think we're entering a period where the United States is not going to be pushing strongly for further opening of the international economy. Okay, so again, there's broad similarities, but here there are also very significant differences of degree here. For Harris, the best sense that we have is that she sees tariffs as instrumental to some foreign policy goals. So certainly they're going to be, she would propose in all likelihood, tariffs targeted on China, but primarily seen in terms of an instrument for trying to gain leverage in that relationship. Trump, on the other hand, seems to have a very fond relationship with tariffs. He has called tariffs the most beautiful word in the dictionary. This is a word cloud from a recent speech that he gave on economic policy, and you can see there how tariff figured very prominently in that speech. In addition to talking about a 60% tariffs on China, he's talked about 10 to 20% tariffs more broad-based on other countries, 100% on cars from Mexico. So he's floated lots of different ideas about tariffs. He seems to have a philosophical attachment to them that, again, not just as a source of leverage, the way I think Harris would approach it, but as a way to really fundamentally restructure the U.S. relationship with the world economy. Right? He sees them as a way to bring manufacturing back to the United States. He sees them as a source of revenue. From what we can tell, he seems to think of them as a way of carrying on international competition that doesn't impose costs on us, it imposes costs on other countries. And so hence his relationship with them. So from the perspective of countries in Asia, so targeted sanctions on China, obviously those would hurt China. There's some chance that they might have some beneficial effects on other countries in the region that might, benefit from shifting productivity. But the broad-based sanctions that Trump is talking about would obviously be problematic for most countries in this region, as is the risk of Trump pushing the world trading system to a crisis or breaking point, which so many countries in this region depend on the stability of that system. Okay, so those are the kind of two big areas, China and trade. I want to talk about, I just want to highlight a few areas where I think what I'm going to call relatively bipartisan issues. And again, recognizing that there's very few issues that are where the parties truly, totally agree with one another, but these are ones where the degrees of difference are somewhat smaller. So just quickly here, and I'll just to flag these, and you can come back and ask me questions about them later. With respect to North Korea, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula remains the official policy, but I think both parties realize that's unlikely to happen anytime soon. So we have settled de facto into a policy of deterring and managing the threat from North Korea's nuclear weapons. I don't imagine either candidate would be able to change that very much. There's relatively strong consensus on the containment of Iran in the Middle East and preventing it from getting a nuclear weapon. There had been very significant partisan differences in how one does that, with the Democrats pushing for the original nuclear deal with Iran in order to freeze their program in exchange for the relaxation of some sanctions. As we know, Trump undid that deal, and there has not been any ability to get back to it. I think the realities of the world are such that it's unlikely that either candidate would be able to strike that deal in the near future. And finally, support for Israel is something that has relatively strong bipartisan consensus in the United States. The Biden administration's policy with respect to the recent conflict in the Middle East has been to prevent escalation, to restrain Israel to some extent, while at the same time shielding Israel from any consequences for not engaging in restraint. Trump is almost certainly likely to give Israel an even more of a blank check, but in practice, it's not clear how big that difference would be between a Harris and a Trump administration, given the constraints there. I'm more uncertain about this prediction because maybe Harris will respond to shifting dynamics within the Democratic Party. But overall, I believe that the political constellation is such that support for Israel is likely to remain bipartisan going forward. Okay, now we move into areas with bigger difference, and I'm going to go through these a little faster. This one I think is the most obvious one, with the policy with respect to Russia, Ukraine, and NATO. So the next president is going to deal with a number of questions in this set of relationships here. So the extent to which we continue to provide military and economic assistance to Ukraine, the conditions under which the ongoing war might stop. I think it's quite possible that there would be a push for some kind of halt in the fighting under either administration going forward, but the terms could be quite different depending on whether it's a Harris administration or a Trump administration. And then more broadly, the commitment to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Trump has made no secret of his opposition to continued support for Ukraine. In that opposition, he has a lot of allies in his own party. He's made no secret of his skepticism of NATO and of Germany in particular. In fact, in the final days of his first term, he tried to pull US troops out of Germany, but was stymied from doing so. Every president has at times complained about burden sharing with the NATO allies, but Trump has been really unique in his willingness to wield threats of abandonment in order to try to leverage greater investments from those allies. And of course, his admiration for Vladimir Putin of Russia is something that we've seen and marveled at quite frequently. So in this respect, I expect very significant differences between the two parties, regardless, as a function of who wins. So I know while you sitting here in East Asia, you worry about this and the uncertainty. Let me tell you that your counterparts in Europe are very nervous about this election because in many ways the stakes there are considerably higher. Some other key areas of disagreement that we could talk about. I mean, a really important one to talk about is climate change. It's hard to imagine an issue where there's more disagreement because Harris thinks it's happening and thinks we should do something about it, and Trump doesn't. And so, international efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are much more likely to move forward incrementally under a Harris administration than a Trump administration. Obviously, there's very big differences on immigration that we could talk about. Democracy promotion and development assistance as well, issues where Democrats are more likely to continue pushing for kind of issues like human rights and promoting democracy and giving foreign aid for development, where Republicans have become very skeptical to the point of largely abandoning those goals. Okay, so that's kind of a broad overview from kind of areas where there's some relative agreement to areas where there's very severe disagreement between the parties. But as I suggested at the beginning, we need to now turn to Trump himself as a factor in this. Why is Trump a kind of a unique factor that makes it difficult to predict what's going to happen? Well, first of all, he says a lot of extreme things. He takes on very extreme positions, and it's difficult to know if he really means them, right? And so when he says these things, like, I'm going to impose 20% tariffs on every country in the world, does he mean that? Or is he just, is this just rhetoric? Or is he staking out some bargaining position that he hopes to move away from? It can be very unclear. He's also full of contradictory impulses. So particularly with respect to China, he's expressed hostility towards China and the Chinese Communist Party. But at the same time, he's made threats of abandonment against the very allies that we rely on to kind of manage the risk of China. And he's expressed a great deal of personal admiration for Xi Jinping. Right? So what's his actual policy? What is he really going to do? Right? There's a lot of uncertainty there. And then there's also uncertainty about whether he can actually get these things implemented. And in this respect, it's important to point out that even though Trump has won the Republican Party and transformed it largely in his vision, there remain even factions within the Republican Party that still cling to what I described earlier as the internationalist consensus. So, for example, large chunks of Republicans broke with Trump and supported military aid to Ukraine. And so it's always been unclear to what extent can he actually get his proposals through, particularly if Democrats and internationalist Republicans still have the potential to team up within Congress to get things done. So there's a great deal of uncertainty generated by him. Now, in the first term, he faced a number of constraints. And so you might be tempted to think, well, we saw him in his first term, so he's in some ways a known quantity. Can't we just assume the second term will be a lot like the first term? And I want to suggest that the answer to that is no, we can't. Because there were a number of constraints that operated in his first term that I want to suggest are not going to be as relevant in his second. So he appointed a number of advisors in his first term that were from more of the mainstream kind of old school Republican internationalist consensus. And on many occasions, they blocked or slowed down things he wanted to do or convinced him to change his mind. He also encountered on several occasions foot-dragging from the Pentagon, that he would want to do something like pull troops out of Syria or pull troops out of Afghanistan, kind of on an impulse. And the Pentagon would kind of slow roll these initiatives until he could kind of be talked out of them. And then there were also some instances where he faced pushback from Congress. So, for example, bipartisan majorities in Congress passed sanctions against Russia in spite of Trump's opposition to it. Right? So he couldn't fully enact everything he wanted to enact in his first term. But what I want to suggest is that his second term, many of these constraints are not going to be there. Right? So he's going to appoint more like-minded people to be his advisors, and has a very clear plan to penetrate political appointees deeper into the bureaucracy so that he doesn't face as much resistance from bureaucratic actors. He will, of course, also be a second-term president, which means he's not eligible for re-election. And kind of historically, we know that second-term presidents are much less responsive to public opinion, much freer to do what they want to do. He could still face some pushback from Congress, but a lot of that will then depend on how the congressional elections turn out, which are also quite uncertain, and how much of an internationalist Republican Party remains in what's elected to Congress. So this kind of combination of his extreme and somewhat erratic positions combined with this lack of constraint is going to create something of a roller coaster ride for us if he's elected. So like I said, he's talked about imposing 100% tariffs on goods from some countries. Like, will he do that? Is that just bluster? Will someone talk him out of it? Will Congress stop him? Technically, Congress controls tariffs in the United States. The president exercises some authority over tariffs using delegated authorities that are supposed to only hold under exceptional conditions. Would Congress stop him from some of these more broad-based tariff plans, or would they not? I don't know. Will he pull U.S. out of NATO? Will he remove U.S. forces from Germany, as he's sometimes threatened? Again, it's hard to know. Is this just a bargaining ploy to get them to increase their spending, or does he really want to do this? And as I suggested with respect to Asia, this is very kind of transactional relationship, often bolstered by threats of abandonment. Now, how hard is he going to push? Hard to know. But this uncertainty has a lot of implications, and this is, I think, a concern going forward. Uncertainty has impacts. It's not just makes it hard to predict what he's going to do, but it has real impacts on international outcomes. It can increase the risk of miscalculation by creating uncertainty about whether the United States will come to the aid of certain countries. And from the perspective of allies and partners, I think there's almost certainly they have to think about hedging against the kind of extreme outcomes that a Trump might generate. So all of this is to conclude by just a few thoughts here summing up. So first of all, to say the obvious, the stakes are high. I hope I've convinced you that there's very significant differences across a lot of dimensions between these two candidates and what they might do. I think the stakes for Asia may be lower than the stakes for Europe, as I already suggested, but still not zero, because significant differences remain, even with respect to issues of how to carry out competition with China and on trade. I think that, in general, the polarization that we're seeing in the United States and the declining support for internationalist foreign policy creates a great deal of uncertainty going forward about the United States as an ally and a partner. And so, again, from the perspective of countries thinking about aligning with us, I worry about how trustworthy we appear, and particularly given the potential for significant swings in foreign policy moving forward. And then finally, as I suggested, all of this uncertainty gets multiplied in the event that a President Trump wins. Because I think then lots of bets are off, and we're in for a very wild ride. So with that thought, I wish I could end on a more optimistic thought. I'm going to stop, and I look forward to your questions about things I covered, things I didn't cover. But again, remember, I don't know who's going to win. Thank you.
I think you'll agree with me that Professor Schultz has given us a superb and crystal clear database account of the trends in US politics that also drills down into the similarities and differences between the two parties, including some very sophisticated sort of analysis of the differences between them two. And I think in doing that, you have really helped us understand the stakes involved, regardless of who wins, right? And then implications for both Europe and Asia. So I think we can begin our discussion with questions from the floor. May I ask that if you ask a question, please use the mic and identify yourself and keep your questions, succinct. So why don't I start by abusing my moderator's privilege? And maybe to ask you, Ken, a question about the broader context. You teach IR theory, right? And I find that even among the IR faculty in this school, we disagree on how to describe the world today. Right? Is it multipolar? Is it bipolar? All right. What's your sense? When you look at the world today, because as you know, those of us who are so-called trained in IR, there are very different implications. When you listen to practitioners in Asia, they tend to say it's multipolar. That's my impression. All right. Some scholars say it's bipolar, and I was wondering, what's your take?
So my take on this is that we are definitely in an emerging multipolar situation, right? That is to say, it's clearly evident that we're entering a situation where there's several different centers of power, and they differ, in terms of which dimensions of power you're thinking about as well, which is another complication on the whole distribution of power issue, which is what kinds of power are we talking about? But I think that aside from the question of simply labeling multipolar versus bipolar, one could step back from that and think about why we think it matters which of those labels holds. Because there's this tendency to think that bipolarity is stable, yep, and multipolarity is not. Okay, I am more likely to think that we're moving into a less stable period, and I don't think this is going to look like a stable bipolar period. So labels aside, the implications of this for the kind of the stability of on kind of conflict issues, on the stability of institutions, and all these things, I worry about strain on all of those things.
Okay, I think I'll stop. I have several other questions, but I think we should give the floor a chance to have a conversation with Professor Schultz. Yes, I see a hand over there.
Hello, my name is Makita. Thank you very much for your lecture and for coming all the way here to Singapore. I'm a class of 2024 for Master of Public Policy here at LQI. So my question specifically pertains to your discussion of some relatively more polarized issues versus some, I guess, more bipartisan issues in a way. I specifically want to ask you, what are your possible predictions on dynamics of how these issues interact and the different parties' support towards these issues or positions towards these issues as we have different actors and different, I guess, main characters of these certain issues like interacting with each other. So for example, like we have North Korea sending their troops to Ukraine to fight against Ukraine. We have Russia and their BRICS countries doing a lot of other, trade discussions, trying to think of their alternative currencies to trade among each other. So I'm curious with this, I guess, separation of polarized and bipartisan issues, do you see any evolution of how different parties approach or change their certain topics? And just generally, I guess, your general thoughts about like what might happen as these issues become more entangled. Yeah.
Yes, and thank you for the question. So I did kind of analyze these questions in isolation, but the world is rarely that simple. And so you get this intertwining of these issues in a way. And then you add on top of that the fact that the world is likely to, some events are going to happen that we don't even anticipate right now that are going to create uncertainty and interdependencies between these issues in ways that we can't fully predict at this point. So, I guess what I would say, just going to start muddling through this, the answer. So there's a kind of a democratic consensus that starts to link things together. There's a phrase that sometimes gets used that's it's the axis of upheaval, right? Which is a view that at the moment what the U.S. faces is a kind of an axis between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, and that in some sense we are in conflict with that. Now, the issue there, though, is, of course, that's a lot of fronts to be in conflict on, and a lot to manage, and a lot to juggle. And so there's almost certainly there's a certain amount of kind of muddling through and improvisation that's going to happen as you do that, and putting out of fires. All the alternative, to the extent that there's a kind of a coherent Republican alternative to that is a China first policy, which tries to basically say, no, everything should be subordinated to focusing on the one most important relationship, most important adversary. And that then says we don't need to worry about kind of all this kind of global and all the trade-offs between them. But even that's hard to do because but of course Republicans also want to be fighting with Iran, and so so all of these kind of broad ideas that they have, when the rubber hits the road, it ends up being lots of compromises and lots of putting out fires and dealing with crises because a lot of the action here is actually driven by external players that kind of force us to make these choices. Does that get to your question?
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you, Professor Schultz, for the very insightful lecture. My name is Jonathan. I'm a lecturer at the local Institute of Higher Learning. So my question relates back to the region we're in, Southeast Asia. And we see that in Donald Trump's first 4 years, there was a lot more focus on the domestic issues, and Southeast Asia was kind of like a less priority. Whereas when President Biden took office, he actually re-engaged the region with the expanded defense collaboration with the Philippines and the protection of Philippine ships in the Scarborough Shoal. So in the event that President Trump were to win the election, and given the changing global developments, could Southeast Asia be on a higher level of his agenda? And if Kamala Harris were to win the election, we know that she may follow in the footsteps of President Biden in engaging Southeast Asia. But what new forms of engagement could she bring to a table given her style of diplomacy? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So the first thing I want to say is that you started your observation about domestic, and I do actually, even though we're here talking about foreign policy, both of these candidates have very ambitious ideas about domestic politics that are almost certainly going to be the thing that they start to focus on. So I don't imagine major initiatives early on because that's typically new presidents. They have a short window of time in which to enact a domestic agenda, and that's what they're primarily going to focus on. The thing is, as the United States, the world often doesn't let you do that, right? Because the United States, ends up things happen and they start reacting, and so almost certainly there will be developing initiatives. With respect to Harris, I don't. I don't know that there's anything particularly new. I mean, she herself is something of a novice in this area. We don't know as much about even her advisors and who this would write. I mean, it's only 100 days ago that I think she became our candidate. So to some extent, she's going to have to rely on some of the existing, kind of national security personnel, and so I would imagine that the initial impulse will be kind of just continuing these initiatives to kind of build multilateralism, which fits very much in kind of her philosophy and the party's philosophy. With Donald Trump, again, big uncertainty here, and if you're not on his radar screen early on, you might be better off in that regard, right? So. He has a very ambitious domestic agenda, which includes what he claims to be mass deportations of unauthorized immigrants, right? So there's just like a big set of things he's going to want to do. He's going to want to turn over personnel within the bureaucracy. I think the real open question is how quickly does he push on this kind of broad-based tariffs push? That to me is the one I don't like. He talks about it again. Is it talk? Is he going to try to get something through Congress? I doubt it. But I think that any kind of if his first steps in office are to act on his impulse are tariffs, and that's where I would expect him to move first.
Thank you, Professor Schultz, for your words. My question is, you started off with the bipartisan attitudes towards international policy. How closely aligned are they to those of the candidates? Because I imagine that, for instance, on the topic of Taiwan, there is generally quite broad bipartisan support to support Taiwan in the case of a Chinese invasion. But Trump explicitly said that we'll help them if they pay us. My sense, at least, is that many Americans are voting for Trump not for his foreign policy, but for his domestic policy.
I think that's right. I want to make sure I understand the question. So I would say on your last point, I would say, first of all, most Americans are voting for our domestic policy, period, whether they're voting for Harris or for Trump. That's certainly true. Most Americans are not heavily focused on questions like Taiwan. And I think as you saw in this slide, the support for military support for Taiwan is actually the lowest among most Americans. There has been nothing in the way of effort to prepare Americans for the possibility of a military action over Taiwan. Now, that's not to say that it won't happen, that the U.S. wouldn't get involved in such a thing, but the public is not something that's being talked about. It's not something that's been prepared. So in terms of the actual positions of the parties, Harris has articulated the kind of standard ambiguous formulation of we'll support Taiwan's self-defense, which leaves open the question of to what extent there would be direct military assistance in the event. And as I've suggested, Trump is a little over the place about, he really wants Taiwan to pay, and by the way, you took our semiconductors from us. And so there's a lot of uncertainty there about what he would do. This is an area where the positions are kind of intentionally not all that well articulated, nor that much subject of debate.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I wondered if I might press you a bit on Trump, the individual himself. In your description of him as a unique factor, you spoke about the extreme positions that he takes on and that are often contradictory, inconsistent. Yeah. But there is one dimension along which he has shown a great consistency, and that is his personal ego. I mean, Kamala Harris in their presidential debate, leveraged that to great extent. Yes. She got him all flustered, talking about the size of the audiences and his rallies. He couldn't focus on anything else after that. But also, the observation has often been made that those foreign leaders who have been successful in dealing with him, Vladimir Putin, Viktor Orban, and others, are precisely ones that have played to his ego. And I wonder if I could get you to say a little bit more about how that might, in fact, make him actually extremely predictable and subject to strategic manipulation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And in fact, that is the one thing about him that is extraordinarily predictable. And you're right that leaders the leaders who figured that out and leveraged it did so quite effectively. So you might think, oh, well, we know how to deal with Trump. He's easy. Like, you just kind of, stroke the ego, talk about the size of his hotels and how great a real estate investor he is, and you can get him to do anything you want. And that could be right, but I think the risk that kind of personality carries with it, though, is that he's kind of susceptible to the last person that speaks to him, right? And so if you're going to do that kind of strategy, you kind of got to be the last one to speak to him before he makes the decision, because otherwise the next person who knows precisely the same strategy can get that to change. And so this was in his first term. One of the ways that advisors of his got him to back down from some positions was, again, to kind of figure out a way to frame it in a way that played to his ego. In the case of Syria, he really wanted to pull all U.S. forces out of Syria, but they figured out if they just told him, no, we could keep U.S. forces there, they'll protect the oil, and you really want to protect the oil. And he liked that formulation, and it was a way to get him to maintain a deployment in Syria, which persisted quite longer than he ever anticipated. So yes, I do think, so if you're a foreign leader, if you're a foreign diplomat, you've got a psychological profile on him. That's the thing you're going to try to play, and it might work for you, but it also might not if you're not the last person in the room.
Hi, my name is Yap Wai Ming. I'm a lawyer in private practice and also with a U.S. law firm. This is President Trump. Second chance at running for presidency, and I think that this would be the final 4-year term if he ever wins, and that being the case, will it make him a lame duck president from day one, in the sense that there will always be this situation where if Kamala wins, she has a possibility of a 2-term. And the other thing is that if he loses, he has already said upfront now that he's going to deny the election as he would have done in 2020. Would that mean that there will be a kind of a delay in terms of the installments relating to who's going to be chosen the president, and also because whether there will be a repeat of Capitol Hill? So I need your assessment on that.
Yeah. So let me take those in reverse. So he's made it very clear that he doesn't think he can lose a fair election, and so any election that he loses must have been unfair. He's been open about that. And so I do think there's legitimate concern about, in the event of a narrow loss, what happens next. And I think it would be reasonable to expect we're in for a period of uncertainty. The big difference, a significant difference between this year and what happened in 2020, a couple of differences. So first of all, there was a change to some of the rules, the laws, the electoral laws, that eliminated some ambiguities that he tried to exploit in 2020. So hopefully the legal framework has been clarified. But in addition to that, of course, Biden will be president until the end of January. Biden will be the one in charge of the National Guard and the military, and not Trump. So, again, I don't like having to say that, because it really shouldn't be how elections get decided. But those are differences between now and then. But with respect to your first question, yes, if he's elected, he will be a second-term president. He will be ineligible for re-election. He will be a lame duck. Now, there's kind of two things to this. Sometimes, so lame duck could imply not much power, because you're done, and in some sense people start writing you off. But the other way in which lame duck matters is that you will never again be accountable to an electorate. And so we know that presidents often do bold, risky, potentially unpopular things in that status, precisely because they will never again be accountable to an electorate. And then the question comes, to what extent does the party then constrain? So that's the main thing, is you yourself are never up for re-election, but your party might care. And so sometimes party loyalty is such that the second-term president still cares. They want their successor and all that. Trump is not as much of a party player. That's one of the reasons I think he will be very unconstrained, certainly not by public opinion in that regard.
Thank you very much for the lecture. Very interesting. My name is Kevin. As you can tell by my accent, I'm not Singaporean. but I have had the pleasure of living in this wonderful country for many years. I think prior to 2016, if you'd asked most of the leaders in this part of the world, they would have said, we would like to live under the American security umbrella, but trade with China, given the size and scale of the Chinese market. And my question to you is that going to become increasingly difficult to do, and actually many countries will be faced with making a choice between either focusing on their relationship with America or focusing on their relationship with China, because it will be very difficult to be in that sort of juxtaposition of being security under the US umbrella and trading with China. So that was my first question. My second question is that given Mr. Trump's, or President Trump's feelings towards the Russia, China and Iran as we understand them, which are quite different, is there a chance actually that could pull that axis of upheaval apart, because he can sort of drive a wedge between particularly China and Russia, but also Iran in terms of what their priorities are in their part of the world? So, for example, if he was able to reach an agreement in Ukraine that was sustainable, would that actually take a lot of the heat out of the Russian relationship, which means that the axis between Russia and China would weaken? So they're the two questions I had.
So yes, thanks for asking about this kind of straddling strategy of we do trade with China, we do security cooperation with the United States, which is a very attractive straddle for lots of countries to engage in. From my perspective, the United States should not force these countries to choose there, because I worry. I'm not sure which way they would choose, and I'm not sure the United States is in the right position to force that. I do think under Trump that choice might become starker. Again, this is a hypothetical, but what if Trump were to come in and say, okay, Japan, or okay, South Korea, if you want U.S. troops on your territory still, you got to stop trading with China. That would put them in a very, that would be a horrible choice for them to have to make. And I think that so the risk of that kind of choice being imposed does get higher under a Trump administration. You all may know better than I what different countries would choose if forced to make that choice. With respect to your second question, I think the serious foreign policy thinkers who have gravitated to Trump might articulate something like that as a vision. That is, like, we got to end the war. We got to make some kind of deal that ends the war between Russia and Ukraine, and then good things become possible because that might kind of cause some of the things that are the factors that are pushing this axis of upheaval together. It'll be centrifugal. So I do think that the kind of Republican intellectual foreign policy leaders who've gravitated to Trump are thinking along those lines. I think the major concern is that any deal to end the war between Russia and Ukraine it's not going to just be we're going to sign a deal and the war is going to be over. There's going to be a deal, and then it's going to be very important to construct terms that allow the deal to remain stable, because both sides are going to see if any deal is a pause in fighting that will allow them to rearm until the next round. And so the question is, how do you prevent that from happening? How do you prevent a relapse to fighting? I don't think the Ukrainians trust the Russians to live by any deal. And so it's going to matter a lot constructing terms that generate stability rather than terms that just generate a temporary pause before the next round of fighting begins. And I think that's going to be really hard. I worry that Trump hasn't really thought through what it would take to make that kind of a stable deal. Of course, the flip side is that I think it could be that the obstacles to that kind of a deal, Harris might see them as so great that no deal is worth making, and that could be a challenge in its own right. Because at some point, I do think the fighting needs to be brought to an end.
Okay, just to add to your comments about being forced to choose, I think you're spot on. Not sure if you have heard of the story about a very high, senior Singaporean policymaker telling a very senior U.S. official, please don't force us to choose, because if you do, you may not like the choice.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So okay, I think yes.
I think Trump may believe that countries here need us
Exactly. Yeah.
so much that they can force them to choose and they'll pick us.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
again, you tell me if he's right.
Yeah.
Hi, hello, Professor Schultz. Thank you for your speech. My name is Ethan, and I'm a year 4 PhD student of computer science at NUS. So I guess I might be the audience with minimum knowledge in political science here, but I still enjoy your speech. So my question is that, what do you think is the biggest strategic failure of US foreign policy in the past 50 years? And if there's any, has it impacted now and the future? Thank you.
The biggest strategic failure of U.S. foreign
All right.
policy.
Is that one?
Is there so many to choose?
Oh. Okay.
No. So let me. This. I mean, it's a hard. Let me give you an honest answer to this, though. Which. So I think that if I mentioned before that there's this declining support for internationalism in the U.S. and I mentioned one reason for it. Being this kind of shifting of the kind of constituencies. But another big reason for it is what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? If most of my students, college students, are very skeptical of the U.S. playing an active role in the world. So I didn't show you this, but there's an age variation on this too. That younger people, I mean, and why shouldn't they be skeptical? I mean, they grew up watching the U.S. Go into a war in Iraq based on premises that turned out to be wrong, having planned poorly for it, getting stuck in a war in Afghanistan for 20 years, and not ultimately succeeding in its goals. So these, in addition to all the harms that they created directly for people in Iraq, people in Afghanistan, and in the region, is one part of the story to why a lot of Americans are very skeptical and even open to Trump's arguments, right? They see that his criticism of U.S. foreign policy, his criticism of the establishment that brought about these failures, resonates with a lot of people, right? So I think Iraq and Afghanistan are huge mistakes. They're slightly different, and there's a longer lecture to give on the natures of the various mistakes made there that had lasting implications for U.S. foreign policy.
My name is John Driscoll, a professor, class of '76, third-generation graduate. Happy
Your
to
T-shirt.
Well, and my hat's over there too. I walked over there. Happy to hear you enjoying your visit to our wonderful republic. I've been here more than half my life. I arrived in 1985. I'm a retired oil trader. And years ago, I made the decision I belonged here. To become a citizen, I had to relinquish and renounce my U.S. citizenship. I have to say, recent events, it was a prescient and sound decision. You'll enjoy your time out here more than you will being in the U.S. If I may, just two real simple questions. This world liberal-based, rules-based order that we've had since the Cold War, it's been U.S.-led hegemony. We've had people like our former ambassador, Kishore Mahbubani, highlight the shift to Asia. In the U.S. adapt. You've got these so-called realist political scientists like John Mearsheimer, Stephen Walt, talking about it's all changing. Looking at the theme here of the future of U.S. foreign policy, I want to ask you, isn't one major requirement of this, the U.S. has to change its mindset? This whole, top-down order that's led by the U.S., is that sustainable going into a world that's becoming, non-aligned, multipolar? That's my first question. And my second one is, my dear friend and colleague and classmate, Larry Diamond, works with you, I think, Freeman Spagoli. He's expressed, going back a few years, questions about the sustainability of democracy. We're in a democratic recession, his exact words. Larry Diamond, I might add, visited our republic years ago. He wrote about it in his epic book, The Spirit of Democracy. He actually met with Lee Kuan Yew and interviewed him. And we've debated fiercely about Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. I'm a good Singaporean. This to me is nirvana paradise. Larry, we have lively but civil debates. Part of the U.S. leadership is this promotion of democracy. And yet, it seems that that is deteriorating. Democracy may not be the answer. You have the ascent of the autocrats, the strongmen. So those two simple questions.
All right, so which is good, which is better, democracy or dictatorship, or which is, no, sorry. Okay, big questions, and I'm going to start struggling through a couple of answers to them. So look, let's roll back to the 1990s, and the Cold War has ended, and the United States believes at this time that that stability in the world is going to be a function of an expansion of its institutions, both international in the sense of the international institutions that it helps sponsor and leads, and domestic, the democratic institutions, and that these kinds of institutions at the rule of law at the international level and democracy at the domestic level is going to be the formula for a more stable world going forward. Now, is there a sense in which there's a certain narcissism to that belief? Well, it's our institutions, they're good for us, they must be good for the world. Democracy is kind of, we love it, it must be this universal value, it must be good for the world. And so yes, there is a certain kind of sense in which kind of pushing the American leadership and the American model was believed to be the right way to go. And then I think what you're seeing, of course, is that there's lots of countries around the world that didn't see that as an inviting model, right? That saw it. Russia saw that as a threat, as a very threatening model to it. China has benefited a great deal from some aspects of that model, the kind of the stable trading system, but certainly wants no part of the proselytizing about democracy. And so it's all been contested, and different states have contested different aspects of it. And the issue that I think we face in the U.S. is that the kind of asymmetric power that we had at that moment of the 1990s when this vision is articulated, it's gone, right? And it is a more multipolar world, right? And so, yes, I mean, in some sense, there has to be a retreat, a more realistic retreat from some of those broader visions. Because I just don't think we have not going to be able to hold everything up in the face of all the challenges. And so a more pragmatic sense about what is it that we really value, where are the common interests that remain, that still remain, that we can be cooperating on. On the democracy versus non-democracy question, so I am part of the American secular religion that holds that that democracy and human rights are valuable, and I would not give that up easily. I do agree that we're in a period of democratic recession, and democracies aren't delivering for certain people in ways, and those people are losing faith in it. And we worry a lot about young people in the United States who aren't sure it's all that important to be a democracy. Is it really delivering? What is it good for? What do they see? They see this partisan fighting. Right? What's that? And so I feel like there's still a very strong case to be made for democracy, but at the moment we're not making a very good case for it in our country, and I hope that we can get past that.
Thank you very much. And if I were back at the farm, I would love to take your class.
Okay. All right.
And thank you for your lecture. I was hoping you could talk a bit about the impact on American companies operating in this part of the world. We've seen some significant changes with companies downsizing their presence in regions like China and Hong Kong and Taiwan, and shifting focus to even Singapore, India, and others which continue to maintain a fairly large presence in those regions. So with either candidate, how do you see that spanning out for American private sector in this part of the world?
Yeah, so I mean, as I said with Trump, he'd like to see them wind down and come back to the United States. Now, I think he's mistaken to think that's going to happen. But what I think is happening, particularly, in certain sectors, it's the uncertainty that's going to be generated by the possibility of restrictions on trade is going to lead to some winding down. Particularly sectors that think that that the ones that take the most time to kind of wind down and move, maybe the ones that are going to want to try to reduce their presence first. I do think this is creating uncertainty in the business community. I think, reading stories about, companies that are trying to make long-run investment plans, and it's very hard to make long-run investment plans when you just don't know, what's going to happen in terms particularly of barriers to trade, like where are you going to locate, where are these going to be applied? So, again, I think, Trump has this kind of vision in which there's a long-term adjustment whereby that all ends up back in the United States. A, I'm not sure if that's true, but B, even if that were true in the long run, there's a very tumultuous short run to get through before that would happen.
Hi, thanks, Ken, and that's a really very nice, crystal clear analysis of the situation ahead of us. My question has got to do with there's a contradiction between this turn away from internationalism and the desire to be number one in the world. How do you remain number one in the world where you're not going to have an activist foreign policy, a more involved role in the world? From what I know, every American is brought up to understand that America is the greatest nation on earth. So how is that going to be balanced against this desire to be less activist, to be less internationalist? So can America accept that one day it may not be number one in the world, whether it's American elites or American public? Can that happen?
There is a strategy. If what you'd like to do is you've got global foreign policy interests, but at the same time you would like to retrench your commitments and invest more at home, which is what kind of the sense that a lot of Americans are yearning for, then the strategy is to build strong partnerships and have really good allies who are themselves strong, right? As a way to, in some sense, to shoulder the burdens and basically help us out. And so, in fact, this has always been one of the great strengths of the United States has been its allies, right? It's always made us stronger than we were alone. And it's not just because of geography. Of course, geography matters. We needed them for geographic reasons, but it's always been true. And so I still think there's that model. But but yes, there is this kind of incoherence between this kind of self-image of being number one and all-powerful, and on the other hand saying, but we can't do everything in the world, and we need to do less. And I think it's an incoherence that certainly it runs through Trump, but it's not unique to Trump. I think that Americans haven't thought through this question about what is a world like in which we're not number one, and do we wish to be in that world, and what does it look like in that world? And I think that there's all sorts of habits of being number one that we continue to engage in, and that makes it hard to think about what an alternative looks like. So I think this is an inescapable problem. And yes, I think Americans would find it very difficult to think about a world in which they are not number one, and it could come as a very significant psychological break, right? The British went through this, and again, who knows? The U.S. has problems. Other countries have problems too, and so we don't quite know how everything plays out. But I do think that managing this new kind of multipolar, or whatever you want to call it, situation is causing some of the kind of psychic unease that the country faces.
Great. Ken, I thought actually your point about rebuilding back home, right, actually may help America restore its number one position. Because to the extent that more Americans are thinking that it is necessary to focus more on problems at home, and if the successful policies for doing that, that may actually consolidate America's position, right? And I thought your point on that was very salient.
Thank you. Yeah.
We're exactly 6:31. I think you agree with me that Professor Schultz has given us a masterly account of the political trends in American politics and the positions of the two parties, and the way he engaged us through his very succinct answers, to the questions from the floor has been really, very, very endearing and, very informative. So on that note, can I ask you to join me in thanking Professor Schultz for a marvelous session?